talking with God about kings and kingdoms. We're in the book of 1 Samuel up to chapter 26, and this week it is Spearhead. Come on in, let's check it out.
All the Bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Always glad somebody is showing up because we have fun here at the Biblical Channel. Convinced, absolutely, without hesitation, that the Bible is the source for wringing out the chamois of your life to the best of anybody's ability. It puts us in touch with the source. God put together a book. That's what he says. And I think that this book has proved itself through time and memoriam like no other. And if it's read right, it's a lot of fun. And that's my job, is to try to, bring you to the text, have you read the text on your own. I don't want anybody not reading the text. I want you to read the text on your own, but I want you to be able to see the stuff that's going on in the text that is so helpful to us and a lot of fun. So our idea here at the Biblical Channel is to get us all as human beings away from the bullshit to the holy shit, God. And might we start shooting a shit and sounding like we know our shit? That's the thing. That's what we're into. We just want everybody to sound like Mary, that her soul magnifies the Lord. We want our soul to magnify the Lord. Have fun, for God's sakes. For God's sakes, have some fun. And rejoice always, pray continually. That's God's will for your life. That's what he says. So we just want to get the Bible right. And when we do, woo, good things happen. So let's go into 1 Samuel chapter 26 and, take a look at the next episode with David and Saul. So as chapter 26 opens up, what we have is the continuation of a cat and mouse game that David and Saul are playing. Saul hears where David is, and where David seems to be is in the wilderness, of... it's east of Jeshimon, the wilderness of Ziph. I know we don't know where that is, and nor do we care, but it's around some mountainous area, and David is just, staying out of, the main word in this text is spear. He's staying away from Saul's spear. Previously, Saul has chucked this spear at David several times. David is Saul's harp player. David is expected at the dinner table while Saul, continues to rage against David. And we finally found out, that Saul knows what the plan is, and that is God's plan, and that is to put David in as king. Saul apparently disagrees with that, but that doesn't keep Saul from expecting God to show up and give him some direction. And it doesn't keep Saul from, thinking that somehow he is right. The old ancient proverbs, that we find in the Bible say many times, a man always thinks his way is right. The fool thinks his way is right. Every person thinks their way is right. So I don't find Saul to be particularly evil. I just find him to be particularly common, just like all of us. And David himself, while at times he does some extraordinary things, he actually is largely just doing ordinary things that we can all do. That is how the biblical characters always work, because there's only one hero in the Bible, and that is God. So in our text here, David and Saul are playing cat and mouse around the wilderness of Ziph, and there's some mountainous areas. And it turns out David's men spy on where Saul and his men actually lay down for the night. And when he finds out where they lay down for the night, he gets a plan together, because he can see actually where Saul is laying with Abner and with a spear by his head, along with his canteen or his water jar, whatever you might call it. I've got a little spear on my Redskins shirt that I am wearing in, connection with this talk. Lost for words sometime. So David observes where Saul is laying, and he hatches a plan to go down and steal the spear. He doesn't really tell the guys that, but he does say to the guys, he says, hey, who will go with me? I got a mission. I want a guy to go with me. And this guy by the name of Abishai raises his hand and say, I'll go with you. And David says, good. Okay, we're going to go down into the camp. Abishai is all in. David's men, all in. It's a adventurous story, to say the least. And they sneak down into the camp. And of course, there's all kinds of tensions there, right? Because you're expecting, like, come on, man, how do you sneak into a tent of, 300 sleeping men and not wake somebody up? I know I would. You probably know you would. So that builds the tension of the scene. The word spear, though, is really driving the text because it comes up 6 times. And that is one of the ways that the biblical authors, when they put stories together, kind of shape their story and give some humor to their story, or give some sort of, might I say, point to their story. The point to the story all seems to be around this spear, and then also the word head. The spear is stuck in the ground beside Saul's head. And that's why I call this Spearhead. I love Michael Franti and the Spearheads, but this is a different Spearheads. It's even different from this Spearhead. It is all about David spearheading Saul. And that's what the storyline is about. And that's how it gets fun, because David is tiptoeing, like a good Bugs Bunny cartoon along with Abishai down into the camp. And we're thinking to ourselves, we're racking our brains with, how in the world is he pulling this off? I mean, this seems impossible. Don't forget, my friends, you're reading a story about God, and God is the hero of the story. And then we are told in verse 12 why exactly David was able to get away with this. David is not some sort of super sneaky guy. He's not the kind of guy that you have to underestimate his sneakiness. No, David is given an assist by God in God's story about God being the hero. David gets God's assist because God gave a deep sleep among all these men. So it turns out that David probably knocked over some tin cans along the way, probably knocked over a lot of things along the way. Abishai is probably really, quite amazed that they are, still not caught. And when the moment comes where David is going to grab the spear in the canteen, Abishai says, okay, let me run that spear right through him. And David says, no. Which brings us to the way the author has organized, this storyline. He has organized the storyline in chapter 26 around 3 speeches that David gives. And the first, well, you might say 4, really. The first speech that David gives is to Abishai. And what he tells Abishai is this. He says, Abishai, we are not going to do this. This is also why, as the reader, you're like, oh my God, how can you be talking this much and not get caught? Well, again, you are told that God intervenes and creates a deep sleep here. So it's really not the prowess of David. It's God who allows for this scene to unfold. But David gives some really insightful information to Abishai to bring him closer to God. And what he tells Abishai is just this. We are not going to destroy him. You will not destroy him. I will not destroy him, because who can put a hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? You see, David knows God has not told him to actually, kill Saul. And so he's not permitted to kill Saul. David also knows that the hardships that he is living under, well, he's going to have to live under these hardships. And along the way, he's just going to have to wait patiently. But as we see, waiting patiently isn't necessarily David's strong suit, because if he was waiting patiently, he wouldn't be tiptoeing down into Saul's encampment. But we're going to see at the end of all of this that David, by not being silent, is actually trying to be helpful. He does consider Saul to be the Lord's anointed, and so he considers himself to be a helper to him, meaning Saul, to figure things out, to get things right, and to everybody for that matter. And this is a great perspective to have. We are called to just try to give people perspective on the Lord and his anointed. So I think that's just a perfect little segue. But David says, we can't do that because the Lord hasn't directed us to, and we don't do anything unless the Lord is directed to. If we do anything that the Lord has not directed us to doing, we're on our own and we run the risk of being sinful. Well, that's a longer version of what David actually says, but he says, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, and his day will come to die, or he will go down and, perish into battle. So what we see David doing is engaging his imagined reality with God in his imagination. In his imagination, he understands clearly that God can take him out. He learned that lesson, and we might actually give a lot of credit again to Abigail here, because David seems to be heavily influenced by Abigail. Abigail seems to have changed David. David was going to kill her husband without asking any questions. Abigail slowed her down to remind him that he has a special place to be the Lord's anointed someday, but he needs to do it God's way. And that is not just running, into calamity and murdering people and killing people as, they offend you. So in this moment, it seems like David has been heavily influenced by Abigail, and he has also a clear vision of just what God's providence looks like. That David here does not have to orchestrate this moment. He knows that Saul is either going to die like Nabal died, and that is by the Lord's hand. God can take him out. So if God really wants him out, God will take him out. God took out Nabal, through natural circumstances, a pretty cataclysmic stroke, it seems, or heart attack, something of that nature. Within 10 days of having it, he was dead. But he could do the same to Saul if he really wanted him gone. And that's what he's telling Abishai. He's like, hey, God's providence is reigning over all of this, and we got to let God's providence work. So on one hand, God could take him out. On the other hand, well, maybe his time to die will just come naturally, and we just have to wait for that. We don't know. And also, another way that, Saul could die is he could die in battle at the hands of the Philistines. Either way, David's overall point in these 3 points of God's providence and his imagined reality with God's leading is just simply, God can take care of this. David just needs to wait and see how things are going to go. And he needs to proceed. He needs to keep moving. He needs to be an action figure, but he needs to only act in accordance with the way that God called him to act. David is in great shape at this point. So that brings us to another speech that David is going to have. So the mission is successful, as we are told. He grabs the spear by the head a couple times. The word spear and head come up in the text. And then by the time we get to verse 13, David hollers out to Abner. Abner is the right-hand man of Saul. I love this little speech because it is just riddled with good old-fashioned humor. David calls out to Abner. Abner says, yeah. And David says, hey, listen, mate, I think you ought to be put to death because you have been negligent in your duties. If you weren't negligent in your duties, you wouldn't have Saul's spear and his canteen like I do. You should have been doing a better job protecting the Lord and his anointed. And so he just throws this awesome jab, this very sarcastic jab, and basically is creating another one of these moments, which reminds me of the Young Guns scene whenever Billy the Kid, says to Dick, he says, could have had you, Dick, at the dinner table. And basically David is doing the same thing. He's saying, I could have had you, Abner. Could have had you, Saul. Surely you can see that because I've got your spear and your canteen and you didn't know anything. So learn this lesson. So David is creating object lessons for everybody. And I imagine Abner might be quaking in his boots because Saul is not that stable of a guy. And perhaps Saul will take David's counsel and have Abner put to death. I think that's probably going through Abner's mind, but we're not told that exactly. But here David can be funny, and he can be a bit of a dick, and sometimes being a dick is funny, and sometimes being a dick is just being a dick. But here, David is being a dick in a kind of funny way, and he's doing it in a very godly way. But I also think that, this leads into the next speech, which gets to David really exhibiting some good old godliness here, and some good old godliness that all of us can take a cue on. For, what happens is that, Saul says, "Step aside, Abner." He says, "Is that you, David?" David says, "Yes, yes, it is. It is, my lord, O king, it is me." And he says this. He says, "Why? Why does my Lord pursue his servant? What have I done? And what evil is on my hands? So now, therefore, my Lord, the king, hear the words of your servant. Why? Why are you doing these things?" And David goes on to say, if the Lord has actually stirred you up, if the Lord has given you direction to put me to death, well, then may I be as someone chasing after other gods, and may I be, he basically says, may you be successful. If I am going against the Lord, then by all means, I should not be on the planet. And is that, and so he's asking him, are you being directed by God? Are you being directed by Yahweh? Oh, precious Saul, the Lord's anointed. And so this is just a great picture of a takeaway for all of us. Our job in life, is a bit psychology, surrounding psychology. And that is, to simply be asking why. Ask people why. Why do you do what you do? Why do you believe what you believe? Why do you not do what you don't do? Those kind of questions are absolutely 100% legit. And probably, I think, the most detrimental thing about a culture or a society is when people are not allowed to ask the question why. I believe our society has a large group of people who are absolutely trying to silence anybody who just asks the question why. And it's also telling that same group of people who does not want anybody asking them why also never asks the question why, because they're not interested. And herein lies Saul's reality. He's really not interested in being corrected. But David's reality is that he is working for the Lord. And working for the Lord means that you are called to be helpful. And the only way that you really can be helpful is by asking people the question, why? Why are you doing? What is your motivation? What is the game plan that you expect to put into action here? And is this game plan linked with glorifying God somehow? So David has really flipped the script here on Saul. And pointing out that, Saul, you've got some questions to answer as to why you're doing what you're doing, because you should be able to answer for what you're doing. Everybody ought to be able to give an answer for what they're doing, and they ought to feel good about what they're doing. We've got to remember that when people do give you an answer, well, don't be poopy about it. Just hear them out. Be willing to hear them out. Be different. Be that kind of person. And so this is David's, what we might call, third speech. His third speech is directed at asking Saul why. And this, getting into the Proverbs, we've already, recognized that many times, if you read the book of Proverbs in the Bible, you will come to many times where the text says, a man thinks his way right, and a fool thinks his way right. Everybody thinks their way right. But real wisdom is challenging everything and asking the question why. God himself does not mind you asking the question why. The book of Job gives us that clear picture that God is okay with our statements. God is okay. The book of Psalms actually teaches us how to voice our frustrations, even to God, but also to sit back and try to listen for what God has been saying as to what an answer might be. So it is wisdom on view. David is full on. This is a high point in David's life. He is chock full of wisdom at this moment. And let us give credit to Abigail for teaching David the pathway to wisdom and to be wise. And to be wise is to simply ask the question why and listen for the answer. Well, the answer is going to come. Saul says to David, I have sinned. So he basically tells David, you're right. You're right. I'm in the wrong, David. So come on over and let's patch this thing up. Well, David is no fool, as the wisdom literature of the Bible tells us. David is no fool. And David says, well, just have one of your guys come over and get the stuff. I'll give it back to you. No problem. But have one of your guys come over. Because if we remember back to chapter 13, verse 13, Saul has already admitted to David that he was wrong and that he would never hurt David. Well, here he is trying to kill David, and here he is always trying to kill David. So he doesn't really mean what he says. But again, this is just a typical character in our human lives that we live. Saul is now giving us, a nice picture of how people will just, say whatever they want to say. And they may not mean a thing. So we've got to be wiser than that. And David shows wisdom once again by not going over himself with the spear in the canteen. And he says, come on over, bring one, or have one of your guys come over here, and I'll gladly give it over. But this gives David an opportunity to speak for the last time. So his last speech is this. He said, here is your spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hands today, and I would not put my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in your sight. The Lord, may he deliver me out of this tribulation. And therein lies, the gospel message. The gospel message is quite simple. The gospel message is get on the Lord's side here and be directed by the Lord. That the Lord rewards righteousness, that the Lord rewards faithfulness, and being clear with people that we could and, might have had opportunity to do bad things against them, but we choose not to because that is not the way of God. The way of God is never for you to take vengeance. That famous phrase is biblical. Vengeance is God's, says God. It's not yours. And God does not call you to vengeance. Now, clearly, if you were a Philistine, well, you were under the active hand of God's vengeance, but it was God giving the orders. And by the time we get to Jesus Christ, he makes it clear there are no Philistines that God is after anymore. In fact, when was the last time you heard of a Philistine? So that part of the Bible was set aside for our learning, to learn and to see some important lessons, which we can't get into here. But for our sake, this ends David's fourth speech, which again brings Saul around to say something to close out our passage. And what Saul says, blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things, and you will succeed in them. So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. This will be the last time David actually sees Saul. It seems like that, as far as the storyline goes, before too long, Saul is going to die. Tune in next week, and we will see that, what it looks like to lose your head. Not to be spearheading something, but to actually lose your head. And many people are going to seemingly lose their head, including David seems to lose his head. Well, anyhow, losing your head means you're dead. So, next week's talk, deadheads. But before we leave, you can't help but to remember that when Saul was brought into this by God, God connected Saul to the prophets. And Saul himself is a bit on the dumb side. Nobody expects Saul to say smart things, especially as a younger man. He just wasn't that kind of guy. And when God puts this, contingent of prophets around Saul, Saul becomes, one who prophesies. And prophesying, biblically speaking, is largely just about speaking God's words to each other and out loud to one another. God's promises, God's words, God's wisdom, all of that, is fitting under the category of prophesying. Yes, some of prophesying involves future telling, but that's not the whole picture. That's just a small piece of it. Prophesying on the whole is about saying the things that God has said. And here, Saul actually says the things that God has said, that David will succeed, that David will do many things, because the kingdom has been taken away from Saul. Saul has been told this, and the success that is going to follow is going to happen through David. And Saul has, what we might say, a prophetic moment of clarity. And so through the beginning, and in our one of our last talks, we also saw that Saul, trying to kill David, gets tangled up with a bunch of prophets and ends up glorifying God. He can't kill David because God is got a thing going on. And when God's got a thing going on, there's nothing you can do to stop it. And so along the way, people keep saying, is Saul a prophet? And in this case, I think this passage ends by, again, is Saul a prophet? He is able to say godly things. He is able to speak the message of God. But at the same time, we see that Saul is going to be hamstrung by his own unraveling. He is going to lose his head. He's going to keep doing things that keep him away from the promises of God, and he's going to end life very badly. That does not necessarily mean that Saul is in hell. That's for God to decide, not for you, not for me, not for anybody, but that is for God to work out. But what we must see is that in this moment, David is crystal clear with the wisdom of God upon him. And yes, indeed, he is going to do great things, as Abigail pointed out to him, and he seems to be right on track. He's going to lose the track, as all of us do. But let us be reminded and remind each other to the good things of God, like David is trying to do with Saul. He's asking the question why, and he is repeatedly telling everybody, what the clear game plan of God looks like. And he's also encouraging people to trust in the providence of God and not their own foolish, revengeful actions. That much is the tip of the spear. That is the spearhead that we see in David. The spearhead that David really has is the knowledge and the wisdom of God in chapter 26. And so that is something that God is calling all of us to have. No matter what your plight in life or where you are, you can employ the wisdom of God. You can employ the knowledge of God. You can employ, like Jesus employed, the very fabric of God in your scenario. Well, that's where we'll end this time. We'll catch up with you next week for the Deadheads.